Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We would like to have a brief discussion this morning on a hot topic for us all. That is, how do we build a really equal society from the legal standpoint? In Quebec, we're living with two charters saying the same thing, the Canadian Charter and then the Quebec Charter of Values. They're saying the same thing. That is, that citizenship, it has to be based on equality, regardless of your language, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion, that citizens have the same rights and that they are on an equal footing, which means that in such a society, we have to recognize each other and we have to recognize each other as full citizens. And that's all the more the case because now we're under a new system. It's no longer a matter of tolerance. We want to go beyond tolerance because tolerance has always has this overtone that, well, you're telling somebody that they're troublesome, they're problem prone, and they make life difficult, but that they will be tolerated. Tolerance always has that idea that something is wrong, but that will nevertheless put up with it. But quite the contrary. In the Charter, the equality of status is something that people can recognize as a right. So it's no longer a matter of what your attitude is, or it's no longer about your charitable attitude or your goodwill towards me as a citizen. I am claiming full-scale equality. So that's the theory. That's what we're committed to in our modern democratic societies. But the reality is often something else. And I would like to explain or examine why sometimes we have so much trouble experiencing that ideal. And I think that what makes things difficult for us is something that is essential to democracy. That is the power of democracy. But it is that something can veer off in the wrong direction. And I'll try to explain what I mean. What makes democracy so potent? Well, democracy, unlike other regimes such as authoritarian regimes and dictatorships, democracy needs a strong sense of a common identity, the feeling that we share and that we're in it together and that we have common goals and principles recognized by everyone and that we accept everyone. This common political identity, of course, is always, in a way, the result of two orders of consideration. Firstly, clearly, with our two charters in Quebec, our common identity is in part defined by the fundamental principles, the moral principles, and political principles of democracy, equality, and human rights. But at the same time, there is always, let's say, a special element, a historic element that affects us as a people, our language, our history, and so on. Let's call it the patriotism in a modern democracy always contains those two dimensions. Yes, we have the principles, but as Canadians, there is something else. We are committed to this special project that is the project of Canadian democracy. The same thing applies within Quebec. In a way, we are committed towards not only the general principles, but also this project, this attempt, this special attempt to achieve this in our Quebec society. So this strong common identity is necessary. Why? Because democracy requires solidarity, for instance. We have to help each other out often from a social democratic standpoint. There are times when we have to help each other out. We have a wonderful healthcare system in Canada that Roy Romano talked about yesterday, very eloquently, by the way. But the principle underlying that is that we can have access to care, to medical care, when we need it. And all Canadians in our society is there to back up the system, and we are there to help each other out. While I'm in good health, I'll be paying taxes so that you can be taken care of when you need health care, and vice versa. When I'm in trouble medically, you'll help me. So solidarity is vital to a democracy like ours. But at the same time, this common identity assures us that we have this mutual trust in each other. When we discuss about the future of our country, we're talking about the same thing, i.e., the feeling that within society there are divisions, that some only think about themselves and not about the common good. Well, that suspicion would erode a democratic society and could end up destroying it. So for those two reasons, we need solidarity. We need mutual trust. We need that feeling that we're in this together and that we're both there with a common identity. So that's great. And that's exactly what we feared that could basically veer off in a dangerous and negative direction. Why? Because this identity always has a definition. And it is very easy for some people at some point to look at that definition in a way that would exclude other people. And that often happens in two ways. We can illustrate this in two ways. Firstly, there is, in some situations, where there are a lot of international movements. Our society, for instance, welcomes lots of immigrants. That's the case in Quebec and in Canada. And it's the case now in all Western countries. So it's possible that at one point, the old stock people might feel that those who are coming in now don't really share this common culture and don't really share this common identity. And it could happen that people might start getting suspicious and feel uncomfortable and so on. And what was democracy's strength, that is the feeling that we're together, that we agree, and that we have a common identity, could become a problem because it encourages behaviors that represent exclusion and rejection. So in that way, the common identity feeling could turn toxic. The other way that things could go wrong, as I just said, about the common identity, it always has this moral dimension to it. The idea that we both share certain fundamental principles. So it is also possible that through the adoption of false moral beliefs, people might feel that according to those same principles, it's only our group that has those moral values and the others are not exactly the same. The striking example we saw during the last U.S. presidential election was a typical case of that, when Mitt Romney talked about the 47% of Americans, of those who are taking and just takers, and who are not giving anything back and not contributing to U.S. wealth or prosperity, and they're just there to live off the government and off other people's taxes. Such beliefs already create in people's minds two classes of citizens: the full citizens and the other citizens who are considered as parasites and who are not shouldering their fair share of the burden. So such beliefs can lead to a split within society. But Luckily, in Romney's case, in Mitt Romney's case, rather, he lost because of such ideas. But that idea reflects feelings that, or thoughts that many people do actually think without expressing them. Because in the Canadian right, sometimes we feel the same attitudes. That is the belief that the poverty is the result of people's fault, people who don't want to work hard enough, and such beliefs are beginning to create two classes of citizens. So we see that at times something that is really good and vital to democracy, that is having a common identity, can lead to behavior that excludes others. So how do we perceive this? Sometimes some people are considered open-minded and others are closed-minded, that some people are welcoming of immigrants and others are not, but that's not exactly the case. In fact, if we look at the historical development of those trends, it is obvious that all societies at one point are tempted to exclude others. Let's take, for instance, the history of immigration into the Western Hemisphere. And I will include France in that. And you'll see that there is this evolution through time. Let's take the US, for instance. In the beginning, the US Republic was created by people of Protestant culture, of different denominations. And then in the 1840s, the Irish, who were fleeing famine in Ireland, came in, and there was a strong reaction. They were treated as papists, and that they're not like us, and that they're dangerous. And a party was even created back then in the U.S. called the Know Nothing Party. And you can tell that the name was quite eloquent. The Know Nothing Party wanted to at least slow down or delay granting of citizenship to the Irish immigrants, because they were considered as not being a part of us, because their culture was totally different from that of the U.S. settlers. So if we go back in time, we see that the trend is encouraging, because the Americans overcame that. And now all kinds of people from Catholic countries are fully integrated in the U.S. to the point where Kennedy got himself elected as U.S. president. But we've never really, that is never really a done deal forever, because history continues and the sources of immigration do change. And we see that today, for instance, in the U.S., the Hispanics are causing in many U.S. people of Anglo-Saxon stock many concerns, and making they feel uncomfortable. So it's never acquired forever. So democratic people always have to redefine their identity, because that's how they were able to overcome those conflicts between Catholic immigrants of the 19th century. They've had to redefine their identity to be inclusive. Let's take another example, which is rather tragic these days, as far as I'm concerned. Let's take France. I will surprise you by telling you that early in the 20th century, France was an example, a positive example of immigrant acceptance. Between the two world wars in the 20th century, France welcomed a lot of immigrants from Poland, from Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on. And those immigrants were really integrated to the extent where now, unless you go check their last names, you wouldn't tell that these are not French people from somewhere else. But that ability to welcome immigrants was reduced after the Second World War, with the immigrants coming from the Mediterranean, from North Africa. So to cut a long story short, this is what really complicated that relationship was the Algerian War, the long decolonization of Algeria, and that created distrust on both sides. And right now, we see a major chunk of the French population, second generation and third generation North African immigrants or children of immigrants who haven't been integrated into French society, who feel discriminated against and who feel that the police are just brutalizing them. So there is this deep alienation now in that chunk of the French population, and we see now that France is really aggravating that alienation with anti-Muslim measures. So you can see that there are times when societies are successful in welcoming others, and times when we really fail in that endeavor. And to come back to the Quebec society that we'll be talking about later, well, there was this discomfort in the face of what I would call all religions that were not familiar to Quebecers, such as Hinduism, Sikhism, and especially Islam, because many Muslims have arrived in Quebec. And in a very difficult geopolitical context where we're talking about jihadism and all that, there has been this reaction and a violent reaction. So there was this idea of a charter, and Gabriel and myself will be talking about the charter, and we'll look at the mechanisms at play here.
C'est que, de prime abord, c'est l'élément de soupçon, l'élément de sentiment. Ces gens-là n'ont pas vraiment leur place ici. C'était un peu clair parce que lorsqu'on faisait les sondages, on demandait aux gens est-ce que le Québec reçoit.
If Quebec had too many immigrants, if the immigrants were unwilling to integrate and so forth. And it was the same people who voted yes and who were in agreement with the Charter and the measures in it prohibiting the use of certain symbols and clothing in public. So it wasn't necessarily a reaction that targeted those people. It was a generalized sense of discomfort in the face of the arrival of immigrants that didn't seem to really have their rightful place in Quebec. So there was that reaction. But how did certain countries surmount that obstacle? Well, it's clear that if you let time go by so that people can meet and talk and be together, whether it's in private businesses or in public places, if you allow people the time to get to know each other and compare their stereotypes, where they have the sense of being able to create a connection with others, then you can get beyond that stage, just like the Americans were able to get beyond the stage of mistrust of the Irish and mistrust of the Polish. And at that point, something is possible. And we can do the same thing. In fact, in a sense, we've already started to do that, because when there was that struggle and discussion about the Charter, those of us who were opposed to that, we created certain linkages, and I have the privilege of working with people from all religions, Sikhs, Muslims, Catholics, atheists, and together we fought to avoid falling into that trap, the trap that was being set for us by this Charter. And in so doing, we created that solidarity. We got to know each other. There were a lot of Muslims that I didn't know before that I now know, and we built some trust among us. And now I hope we have the embryo of the future Quebec, a Quebec that's gone beyond the temptation to veer off into discrimination and exclusion. And that's how you get beyond it. It's not just by refusing these measures, it's by forming connections, creating solidarity that will build a bridge over those divisions. That's how you can create a society that redefines itself, redefines its identity so as to include those people who were originally considered to be excluded. And that is how the process works in a positive manner. But in the meantime, the example of France will help us to see that we may not succeed. We may not succeed if we create so much mistrust, mutual mistrust within a society, particularly if we start to deal with newcomers as being suspicious. And if we create among them, among these newcomers, that they're not accepted. And I was very sad to speak to some Muslims who said, listen, we're going to leave Quebec, we're going to go somewhere else. And I said, why? Well, we're not accepted here. And we need to fight that kind of sentiment. But it's kind of a race between positive measures that will create solidarity between the different groups and measures that create deep, deep divisions where people who feel they're discriminated against have the sense there's no future for them there. You know, raising their children in that atmosphere prompts them to go elsewhere. And often you can't go elsewhere. And in that case, you continue to have that sense of mistrust and unhappiness. So I think what needs to be done is create those bonds of solidarity. And what you need to avoid is stigmatization. And now let's talk a little bit about the political situation in Canada at this time. We have a Prime Minister of Canada who, with respect to the issue of the niqab, I mean, how many millions of Canadians have never worn a niqab? But on the niqab issue, he allows people to say things to the effect that people who wear that head covering are anti-feminine and so forth. And that kind of stigmatization, the Prime Minister has never spoken to that woman. He never asked her what her motivation was. He simply assumed a lot of things. And what's really dangerous is that it creates a combination. You assimilate a lot of different things. The danger of terrorism and the fact of wearing a headscarf or a niqab. And if you do that, then it's a way of stigmatizing the entire population, all Muslims. It's a way of stigmatizing all Muslims. And that starts to create divisions, a sense of rejection. And ultimately, that can prevent you from surmounting that obstacle. At some point, the bonds of solidarity cannot be developed quickly enough in order to avoid that complete break between two groups. It's as though you had a key or you had a wound and you put some antibiotics on the wound to try and heal the wound. But at the same time, if someone is constantly touching the wound, it only makes things worse. So it's sort of a race, as I say, between those two tendencies. And the game is played in terms of which tendency will be victorious. And that's why I think all political leaders have a very important duty not to get involved in that kind of stigmatization by saying that women that wear the chador are fundamentalists, and like our Prime Minister of Canada has done in Canada about the niqab. It's an attempt in both cases on the part of people who are desperate to win an election and who think they can possibly do that by creating that kind of tension. But if that happens, we'll lose the country that we actually want to create. So that's our situation, and we have to look at it over a long period of time, over the long term. And I think that we can meet all those challenges within our society, but we have to start trying and not be afraid of a first or an initial reaction of discomfort. That's something that always happens. It's perfectly understandable. It's normal. We have a way of experiencing our common identity, and at first glance, people who don't really seem to have their rightful place in society are subject to that. So we have to work to create solidarity and avoid stigmatizing and creating division, deep division within society. So that's the situation, the general situation in Canada now, and I think that this can help us to go further if we look at our situation in a comparative manner. In other words, over the long term, and what's happened in democratic countries that receive immigrants. There are a lot of countries in our hemisphere, not only the United States, but Argentina, Brazil, they also fall into that category. And these days, Western European countries have also entered that category. Without really knowing so, they were becoming immigrant-receiving countries. And Germany didn't really realize what was happening because some people would go back to their country after a while. They would come in to work. But based on our experience here in Quebec and Canada, it doesn't really work that way. And we have 2- and 3rd-generation immigrants or children of immigrants here in Canada. So we all are facing the same challenge, and we must all meet it. There are some that meet that challenge less well than others, but I think both in Canada and Quebec, in the past, we have been able to meet the challenge, and I think we can continue to do so. So I think I've come to the end of my time now, and I'm going to stop here, and we're going to have a discussion. So thank you very much.
Bonjour tout le monde. Est-ce qu'on m'entend?
Good morning, everyone.
Discussion here with our guest speaker this morning, but I'm going to do it in French since it's I think both the language we are more fluent with. Alors, merci, Monsieur Taylor, de cette.
So thank you very much, Mr. Taylor, for your presentation. The theme of your talk this morning and what is stated in the program is inclusiveness in the Canadian and Quebec context, but also in the international context. In other words, renewing a renewal of right-wing populism, a discussion about identity in Quebec and Canada and Europe as well, and we'll come back to that in a moment perhaps. And you started your presentation this morning by talking about the need for all democracies to support a climate of solidarity, mutual trust, and so forth. And I guess democracies need that so that people can imagine a common future based on historical and cultural values, and so that their society can be productive, and so that people can feel they're a part of the discussion. And to begin our talk this morning, I'd like to begin with the debate on the Charter of Quebec Values as an entry point. And of course, we can go a bit further, that maybe we can talk about what happened in Quebec, because I think it's the most recent example we have in terms of the debate on inclusiveness. And I may provoke you somewhat voluntarily, but it seems that Quebec progressives have to face a pretty harsh reality with respect to the Charter, and that is that 15 or 20 polls were carried out to look at support for the Parti Québécois bill, and in all those polls it was quite clear that there was a trend. A majority of Quebecers were supportive of the Charter, and that was across party lines. Of course, the Parti Québécois voters were in favor of it, but also a majority of all the other voters or supporters of other parties were also in favor of it, Liberal and so forth. And this debate took place over 6 months, and despite the number of public debates that took place both on television and in the newspapers, the message of the inclusionists, if you will, if you want to be perfectly frank and honest with ourselves, that message did not convince Quebecers. It did not convince ordinary people who massively continued to support the Charter. Now, in terms of the Charter and beyond the Charter and the question of Quebec independence. So this is a pretty harsh reality for them to have to face. And what I want to ask you to begin with is, how can you explain the difficulty that progressive people in Quebec had in terms of trying to convince Quebecers of their position? Well, I think experience changes your viewpoint, and not necessarily immediate arguments, because there was a part of the electorate that was more supportive of our position, and they were people in Montreal compared to people outside of Montreal. And in the case of Montreal, the fact is that a lot of immigrants live in Montreal, which may be another problem, but these were people who had worked with Muslims, who had met Muslims, whose children went to school with Muslim children. And for many of those people, the stereotypes just didn't work. They seemed inappropriate. So there was that sense there. Now, what does that mean for us? It means that we have a long-term job to do, and in our report, we proposed a number of measures to help people to meet, to come together. There are high schools that could have an exchange between pupils for a week or so. That's done in Europe, between France and Germany, for example. Why couldn't we have a high school class in Montreal and Chicoutimi participate in that kind of exchange? So we had a whole list of proposals, which has pretty much been forgotten along with everything else, I guess. It's been placed on a shelf somewhere, but as I say, this is something that has to happen over the long term, and that solidarity will develop over time. So for me, the defeat of the Parti Québécois, and I think we agree that it wasn't our arguments that led to that. I think the Parti Québécois shot itself in the foot, in a sense. But I think that what we need to do over the next little while is put those measures in place, because when there's a stereotype out there, nothing can really change it other than actually bringing people together, working together. And then people realize, how could I have thought that about these people? So I think it's now a race against time before the next round of that debate, which may come at some point, I don't know, but it won't be immediately. And I think one observation that I made and that troubled me, and I've been trying to explain ever since with respect to that debate over the Charter, is that I realized at some point during the debate in Quebec, to my great surprise, I have to say, that many people in 2012 who were mobilized and who were down in the street supporting the student rebellion, that many of those people, maybe even a majority of those people, supported the charter put forward by Bernard Drinville. And it gave me a lot of food for thought, because I asked myself, you know, what did they see in the 2012 movement that they also see in the charter bill? What prompted them to support the 2012 student rebellion that also prompted them to support the charter? Some people were saying it's just xenophobia and racism, but I think that these were progressive people, left-wing people, and it was all about identity for them. And I'd like to propose a potential explanation and hear what you have to say about it. In the context of what some people call the motivational crisis within advanced democracies, the idea that there's a crisis in terms of people participating in their democracy, the people feel less and less involved in debate, they're disengaged from political structures and civil society structures. So there's a crisis of motivation. And it seemed to me that 2012, just like the Charter project, can answer that. Now, of course, the conservative response is inadequate, and I think we agree on that. But for a number of people, it seems to be an answer. In other words, the ability to participate in a collective plan that interested people. And in Quebec, the question is, in response to this conservative reaction, what are we proposing as progressive people? What kind of collective plan or project can we put forward as an alternative to that? Because it was clear that the legalistic discussion in terms of defending individual rights did not convince people. And I doubt that it's enough to really get people on board with a progressive project. So my question for you is, what is it that we can put forward as progressives that will be inclusive and that will be substantial enough? Yes, substantial enough to get people on board. Well, I think you're absolutely right. The movement behind the Charter is an interesting case, but I think we should remember Van Doos, because what happened in 2012 caused a lot of confusion among certain people who really didn't understand what was going on with that student protest. And we thought we'd built a certain vision of society that began with the Quiet Revolution, and identity was part of that movement. And that's what I was saying earlier. There are positive and essential elements with respect to one's democratic identity. You have a certain vision, you have a certain history that binds you, the Quebec Revolution, the Quiet Resolution, and so what needs to happen at that point? We have to broaden our vision of the future, and I think you've already touched on the potential solution here. We have to find movements of solidarity or ways of building that solidarity among different groups. And when we're facing exclusion, obviously there is no solidarity. But if we try to renew the society, a society that's unequal, a society that's rotting because of inequality, there are all sorts of means and objectives that we can set so that everyone can agree on, whether they're Anglophones in Quebec, long-established Quebecers, and that by creating that solidarity, we create a we that has a different nature, a different character. And that's the task that's facing us. This isn't something we can do overnight. So it's a social issue. So as I understand you, you're saying that it's the social issue that can bring us together and create that solidarity. Yes, exactly, because it's not dividing us. It's not a cause that only involves one group or that threatens the other group. It's a cause that's in everyone's interests. And if you consider an immigrant coming to Quebec, and we looked a lot at that at the commission, but I can tell you it was an extraordinary education. We said to people, why did you come to Quebec? And they said, well, first of all, freedom, and second of all, I want to create a future for my children that I would not be able to create in my own country. So if those people have invested so much in Canada, in coming to Canada, it's because they want to succeed. They want to educate their children, give them a career, find a job that fits with their skills. And there we can see that there's something that brings all of us together. Nobody in Quebec could be against that people who come to this country would like to be able to practice their profession as physicians or whatever. And it only makes sense that they should be able to do that, even though there are a great many obstacles. And there again, we said a lot of things in our report, a report that also ended up on the shelf. Maybe we should start to broaden the debate. I'd like to hear what you have to say about one of my theses that was of great interest to me. I'm sure you know a philosopher, a French philosopher, about a French philosopher who stated in a book that for Muslims, he drew a parallel between anti-Semitism in Europe at the end of the 20th century and the rise of Islamophobia, saying that the figure of the Muslim in current Western societies is replacing what happened in the 20th century with the figure of the Jewish person who had created a lot of social problems.
Do you find this analogy logical? Do you think this parallel should be drawn? Is it a dangerous parallel? Is it enlightening? Yes, it's quite enlightening, because the mechanism that I was talking about a while ago is that there is this feeling that things are not going well, and then we that is really just a summary of a stereotype. It has nothing to do with reality. You basically represent all the fears and the prejudices, and you become a scapegoat. So how do you understand the recent European elections? Well, it's a bit like a return to what obtained in France in the 1880s and 1890s. The feeling that things aren't going well, so we need a scapegoat. For instance, Drummond in his anti-Semitic newspaper in 1890, and you see that in the current speeches made by the National Front in France. The same images are being thrown around. And what is catastrophic in all that is that in the face of economic collapse and austerity and recession, that has been aggravated. In all European recent elections, almost in all the European countries, the extreme right wing has been gaining ground, and more so in France than elsewhere. The polls in France are saying that Marine Le Pen is leading for the presidency, and that the National Front is now seen as less threatening. So we can see that this is now a generalized situation, and the way out of the current deadlock, socially and economically, people are looking for a way out, and they're looking for a scapegoat. And the more progress we make, the less the right-wing movements will be popular. There is a book in which that relationship is actually explained, in that when things are really bleak, when people feel that there is no way out economically, well, those movements are basically encouraged. And back then it was anti-Semitism, and now it's anti-Islamism. We talked about people withdrawing into their identity, and one way of looking at this current crisis of contemporary democracy is that there is the other reaction, that is the security reaction. And right now in Canada, we're seeing that with Bill C-51, which is actually a proposal that is quite ambitious, and it's a security reaction to the situation based on the same arguments as those who want to withdraw into their own identity, for instance, because they fear foreigners. And this is being caused by a new type of terrorism, which is Islamic and based on what is now called violent Islamic fundamentalism. Now, going back to my first question, it seems to me that progressives still have a hard time finding a response to this new terrorism. And the right wing is really out there and ranting about security and saying that the solution to this new Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is to take further security measures and send fighter planes abroad and tanks to take care of the terrorists. But the left is saying, no, that's the wrong answer. We're concerned about civil liberties here, and war doesn't solve any problems. And maybe we should focus more on humanitarian measures. It seems to me that we have a hard time finding an answer to what people feel is a real security threat. And the insecurity is probably being fanned by the right wing, legitimately or illegitimately, but it's real nevertheless. When people are polled, they say, well, they're scared of terrorism. So how do we answer that as from the left? Apart from saying, well, let's not lump everybody together, let's not fearmonger. We should say that, but it doesn't seem to be enough of an answer to people's fears. What is the progressive answer to this? What is the left offering as an answer to this phenomenon? Well, it makes sense that there is a policing issue, and if some young people decide to take violent actions, well, the fact remains that there are two levels at which we should be fighting. There is the police level and even the military level, but we should also try to influence people's minds and spirits. We need to take action to make sure that these terrorist acts would be very rare. And we have to ask, how come young people can find it okay to go out and kill, destroy other people and fellow citizens? And how come their lives make no sense to them? So it's not about force. You don't just go out and strike people down blindly. We have to try to find leaders in the community and sit down with them and find a new approach, try to talk to the young people and convince them, and talk to those whom the young people trust. And we shouldn't create this sentiment that those people are dangerous and that we find them dangerous, because that would play into the hands of the Islamic fundamentalists, because the recruiters would say, well, you, the young people, you are despised here. Why do you stay here? Come join us. And when we stigmatize people, as we just saw with Mr. Harper, well, that exactly plays into the hands of the Islamic recruiters. We have to explain to the public that there are two types of actions that we need to take here. And if we focus on winning people's hearts and minds, that would, if we ignore trying to win people's hearts and minds, we will be creating major long-term problems. And playing just on the at the level of military and police forces would be a short-sighted strategy. Of course, we can send the police in and improve things in the short term, but if we limit ourselves to that, we would be improving the short-term situation, but creating long-term problems. It's hard to explain, I agree. But that is what we can do. But any responsible political party has to continue to hammer on that idea that we have to do more than send in the police and the military. I understand we're coming back to the same argument, which is the social argument. And on that, I think we share the same analysis, because if I understand you correctly, it's only through solidarity in society and through connections that we can counterbalance this retreat into one's identity and isolationism. But it seems to me, and here I'm playing the devil's advocate, I decided to put on that hat today. I believe that if we talk about the social approach, because we keep coming back to this as being the starting point for finding answers, the current debate on austerity, which is the way that the social debate is currently taking shape in society, the left now has a problem with that debate. Because the progressives, as over the last few years, have been basically putting out there the social democratic solution, which looks less and less credible. Because basically, we are saying, let's safeguard let's protect our benefits and don't touch the current institutions because they're doing their job and they're okay. And that puts the progressives and the left in a conservative posture. Well, it puts the left on the defensive against a right wing that is so aggressive and that has been on the attack for the last 30 years. The left finds itself basically in terms of social vision. We're basically saying as the left that we shouldn't change things too much. We shouldn't rock the boat. And in Quebec now, it's the right that has basically taken over the slogan for change. How do we get out of that position? Keeping in mind that that was the conclusion we arrived at when we talked about people retreating into their identities. We have to get out of that rhetoric and try to reach out to the others and take those energies and invest them in social networks in order to create solidarity. But there again, the left finds itself on the defensive. We're trying to defend our benefits. I think the social democratic approach looks stale. And I don't find this solution viable in the long term. So how do you see this position, this social democratic approach today? How do you think it can be renewed? Is it possible to get out of this defensive posture from the right, the left, and how? I would like to have an answer to this question. Yes, it's terrible because we're asking easy questions, right? I would like to ask easy questions, but there aren't any. And you're right as well. Some polls show that many young and older Quebecers feel in a way that we have to do what we can and struggle through this, and that there is no way out through democratic institutions, and that given the current situation, we should do what we can and find a way to keep going. So it's all about survival. Yes, but your movement a few years back showed that that wasn't the only way out. That wasn't the only possible reaction. So the social democratic approach consists in saying that the institutions haven't given their all and that they're not working well. That they're not working well, that the democratic institutions are not working well because of growing inequality in society, and that in the face of such a situation, ordinary Canadians feel powerless. But the powerlessness is not unprecedented. So let's get together. Now, I don't have the ultimate answer to the question, but given this situation in which there is a lot of despair as far as our institutions are concerned, where there is a loss of trust in our institutions, how come you were able to take part in that movement where there was so much energy, with so many young people committed and active in it? And how come the Occupy movement in New York was able to mobilize people so much, yet there was no connection? Well, our student movement in Quebec, you are right that it was a political moment. It was quite impressive. Those who witnessed it could see that the movement was full of hope, that it was really a movement based on hope. But we have to admit, and here I'm actually going against my own camp, but we have to admit that the concrete gains, the political results of that movement are still awaited. That's putting it mildly, because we're like 3 years to the day today that we had that major mobilization in Quebec, yet the budget that came down 2 days ago just confirmed what I'm saying. That is, that we're now in a period of austerity in Quebec, and that the austerity is unbelievable, because we're now witnessing the worst attacks against public services in Quebec for the last 20 years, and that is 3 years after our movement. So the results really aren't very positive. So there is lack of a disconnect between that very energetic movement and party structures in Quebec. And we find that across the board. For instance, the movement in Spain, the 15 de Mayo movement in Spain, hasn't yet changed the system in place in Spain. So that's our next job. because we couldn't get the job done. Separately, that is, between the movement and the party aren't really talking to each other. There is this dialogue of the deaf between the two. But with time, maybe we should be able to do more, because that energy, without being basically absorbed by the other, the movement should stay independent of the party structure, because that's how they keep their energy going. But that doesn't rule out the possibility of agreements. And now we're at a stage where social democratic politicians they are considered to be a spent force. They have no future, and that politicians are all corrupt. Well, we have to go beyond that. We have to find a way to connect. Spain might surprise us the way Greece did. Yes, you're talking about connections between social movements and political parties, and you're saying that the street and the party structures that enable democratic participation. Well, I was going to ask you about Greece and the Greek experience, because in European and American societies, in Western societies right now, that is the place where things have happened in the last few years. There was the Latin American experience, but their contexts are very different from ours. But the Greek experience is quite close to us. I would like to hear you out on that. As an observer of that Greek experience, where there was a lot of social mobilization, it was phenomenal. They occupied the public spaces. They organized general strikes that lasted days, and that led to new political parties. What do you think of that Greek experience? And what do you think about the current tension between Tsipras and his government and the European Union oligarchy? I'm not just asking you this question out of intellectual curiosity, because it seems that the conclusion of the Greek experience will be of significant importance to the whole European left and basically the left across the world. Tell me whether you agree with me or not on this, but it seems to me that as far as European institutions are concerned, their goal is to humiliate Tsipras' government. That is not only to ensure that Syriza doesn't apply their policies, but I think that the European institutions are out to humiliate Syriza and the Greek left in order to send a message to all the other left-wing European parties, telling them that if you try to do what the Greeks did, look at what awaits you. What do you think of that situation? I think the situation is not that simple, because that would also be a defeat for the European Union, because the euro would suffer. So they are not, it's not a one-way street here. We hope that they can reach an agreement. What is unacceptable in Greece is that the austerity program would lead nowhere. The debt keeps rising. They're supposed to be reducing the debt, but the debt keeps growing as in terms of the percentage of GDP. So they had to do something else. Now, there is a way out. There are possible solutions, and I haven't lost hope yet. I'm always too optimistic, but I am still hopeful that they can reach an agreement to enable Greece to stay within the euro, and that maybe they can reschedule some of the debt and restructure the Greek economy. The Greeks don't pay taxes. They're not paying enough taxes. So in Spain, we can also hope that there will be a positive outcome, because the movement is so broad. But it could be a rebalancing of between the movement and the party, and there could be an element of self-management in the solution that they find, and that would be peculiar to Spain. But those are two cases where there are examples that could enlighten us and give us hope. But it could also things could also end in disaster if the wrong side, the side that wants to teach Syrizas a lesson wins, but it would be costly for European institutions because they would really be shooting themselves in the foot by trying to crush the Greeks. So what are the lessons to be drawn by the progressives in Quebec and in Canada? That is from those two experiences, that is the Greek and Spanish experiences. Let's say we're talking about, we need to create, the lesson is that we need to create a combination of movements and parties. We need to adopt broad programs the way we're doing in our in the NDP. But the energy behind all that, the hope that that could create, it can only come from movements, the movements of people who have a broader sentiment and who can focus on issues such as free tuition or free education. And that way, maybe they can channel or use a greater awareness in society, because we have we have in mind this idea, the idea that things shouldn't be going this way, and the fact that things are going less and less well, with a greater growing concentration of power, has created this terrible discomfort. And if this could find expression in movements, or but if people decide that, well, there is nothing we can do against the system, I'm just going to focus on my career, well, the fact is we have evidence that we can do better. People are expressing this in their own way, and you demonstrated that yourselves. So that gives us hope. So if we could find, if those two actions could feed off each other, and also look at each other with the feeling that we're together, and that way we could get somewhere. It's complex. Yes, it's a complex phenomenon. That is the connection between movements and parties. There is the risk. There could be this movement in the other direction. That is the fact that the movements could feed the political parties. Well, that could mean that the movements would be co-opted by the government. That's right. So it's hard to find the right balance. And that's why I feel that the Greek experience could be interesting. But so far, I feel that we have failed in establishing that connection between the social movements and the state. The state's attitude towards the movements has basically greatly hurt the left for the last decades, actually. How do you see what mechanisms do you think we could use to avoid this state co-option of the movements? That could be the consequence of a rapprochement between the two. Well, the problem is that the social democratic movement in general has a problem with that, because historically speaking, social democratic movements have always have the movement and then the political wing, but it's often been very formalized in the form of trade unions and all that. For instance, you have the Labour Party and cooperatives, and in Canada we have unions. But here we're talking about something that is more independent and more fluid. So we would need a new party mentality where we would accept that there is something that is totally independent from us, and that is creating a movement in society, and that the success of our platform and our ideas would depend on that. I think we need to change attitudes in the two camps, and I think it is the party that has to change its mentality first, because the party has to realize there are movements outside of the party. We disagree with what they do, and we often say they're naive. Well, maybe they're naive, and maybe that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, we're all in this together. We have to realize that. And that we all need each other, and we all need each other to be doing well and moving ahead. Charles Taylor, it was very interesting chatting with you.
Merci beaucoup pour...
Thank you very much for this discussion. I would like to ask you one last question. We looked at several topics. We started by talking about the retreat into personal identities, and then we talked about social issues. And my last question is very simple. And this is my question. Charles Taylor, when you look at the current situation, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Well, Gramsci talked about both. Well, I'm not a follower of Gramsci. I must admit that deep down I am an optimist. Maybe I'm crazy. Well, thank you very much. If you're an optimist, well, that means we share another point, another thing in common, because we're just a few years apart in age. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And I wish you a great debate during the rest of the day.